Welcome back to Beyond the Badge. He had never once left a soldier behind, but lying still in a hospital bed with machines measuring the shrinking distance between his heartbeats, Colonel James Whitaker was beginning to wonder whether he had left something far more fragile behind. Not on a battlefield, but in a small village on the other side of the world, where a little boy had once laughed beside a water pump that the colonel's own hands had helped to build. That thought was heavier than any wound he had ever carried. The machines beside his bed kept their patient, measured rhythm, a soft pulse, a careful breath, as though time itself had agreed to slow down out of respect. Morning light came through the hospital blinds in thin gold ribbons, falling across the medals mounted on the opposite wall. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, campaign ribbons from places most people had only heard mentioned in passing on the evening news. The room smelled of antiseptic and clean linen, and yet, underneath it all, if you were still enough, you could almost catch the faint memory of open fields and honest work done far from home. At the foot of the bed, Ranger lay perfectly still. He was 12 years old now. His once jet-black coat had softened with silver around the muzzle, and the edges of his ears carried the gentle wear of a life fully given. But his amber eyes had not moved from Colonel Whitaker's face since the first light of morning had entered the room. He had not shifted when the nurse adjusted the IV. He had not moved when the doctor stepped in, cleared his throat with that careful, practiced gravity that doctors carry, and delivered the news no family is ever truly ready to hear. 2 days, the doctor had said quietly, perhaps less. Whitaker had received those words the way he had once received orders in the field, with a single, unhurried nod. His breathing had grown shallower in recent hours, but his gaze remained steady. Ranger, however, had pressed his gray muzzle gently against the mattress edge in that moment, as though closeness alone could hold his master here a little longer. James Whitaker had served 32 years in the United States Army Corps of Engineers. He had built things designed to outlast him. Bridges over ravines, schools in forgotten corners of the world, water systems in regions where clean water was not a convenience, but the difference between dignity and despair. He believed, with the deep certainty of a man who had seen both destruction and repair, that rebuilding was the most sacred work a soldier could do. War was loud, he used to tell younger officers, but restoration, that took something war could never teach you. He had been decorated for bravery more than once. His unit still spoke of the afternoon he carried a wounded private half a mile under hostile fire, refusing to set the young man down, even as his own leg bled steadily through the fabric of his uniform. Men trusted James Whitaker with their lives, not because he demanded it, but because he had never asked anything of them that he was not prepared to give himself, and then some. His daughter Emily stood near the window now, arms wrapped tightly around herself, watching her father's chest rise and fall with the focused attention of someone memorizing something they are afraid of losing. She had flown in from Colorado the night before, her husband and 2 teenage sons with her. The boys sat subdued in the waiting lounge down the hall. Emily kept her vigil at the window, quiet and still, measuring each breath. "He has fought worse," she whispered to herself, but even she did not sound convinced. Ranger lifted his head at the sound of her voice. His amber eyes met hers briefly, patient, grieving, knowing, before returning to the colonel's face. He had learned, across many years together, that human voices tremble differently when fear has arrived and refuses to leave. Ranger had come into Whitaker's life during his final overseas deployment, assigned as part of a recovery support unit after a convoy explosion outside a small village in East Africa. The blast had torn through the vehicles with devastating force. Whitaker survived, though shrapnel left a permanent map of scars along his ribs and stole most of the hearing in his left ear. The physical damage healed, as physical damage eventually does, but something else remained. Something less visible, harder to treat. Sleep became shallow, silence felt weighted. Ordinary stillness had a way of filling suddenly with sounds that were no longer there. Ranger was trained for detection work, steady under pressure, unflinching under fire, but over weeks and then months, he became something the training manuals had never quite anticipated. He became routine. Morning walks before the heat rose, night watches when the darkness pressed close, a warm, breathing presence beside the cot when memories arrived uninvited at 3 in the morning. He never asked for explanation. He simply stayed. When Whitaker retired and returned to his Ohio farmhouse, the same land where he had grown up, where corn once grew tall and golden through August, Ranger came too, as a matter of quiet, unspoken understanding between them. He slept at the foot of the bed every night. He sat beside Whitaker on the porch at dusk, watching the last colors drain from the sky. He followed him into the fields without ever needing to be called. Retirement did not slow the colonel. If anything, it clarified his purpose. He founded a modest engineering firm dedicated entirely to building water purification systems in rural communities across the developing world. Clean water, he believed, was dignity made visible, one of the simplest and most profound gifts one human being could offer another. Churches donated materials, veterans gave their weekends, young engineers joined because they admired a man who had never stopped serving long after the uniform was folded and put away for the last time. A regional newspaper once ran a small feature with a simple headline, "The Soldier Who Kept Serving." He had kept the clipping in his desk drawer. He never framed it. That was not his way. But good intentions, without diligence, can become their own kind of wound. Years earlier, there had been a project, among many, yet unlike the others in the way it had refused to settle quietly in the back of his mind. A remote village named Odemi. Funding delays, supply chain failures, political instability in the surrounding region that made everything slower and harder and more uncertain. Whitaker had signed off on temporary filtration materials while proper replacements were being shipped, assured by the supplier that the timeline was manageable, the risk minimal. He had trusted those assurances. He had been stretched thin across multiple projects, multiple communities, multiple deadlines. He had believed the system would hold. The replacement components never arrived on time. Reports of illness surfaced months later, quietly at first, then with growing urgency. Maintenance funds had been mismanaged locally, filters had degraded far faster than the supplier's data suggested. By the time independent audits were completed, contamination had spread silently through the very pipes that had been installed with such careful hope and such honest belief in doing something good. Children fell sick. Elderly residents weakened. Official reports were delayed, softened, redirected through layers of bureaucracy that seemed designed to absorb accountability rather than assign it. Whitaker had sent emergency funds from his personal accounts. He had written letters, made calls late at night across unreliable satellite connections, demanded investigations. But the project had already been marked complete in corporate filings. The paperwork said success. The water told a different story. He had carried that discrepancy like a smooth stone in his coat pocket. Always present, never quite heavy enough to stop him, but there every time his hand reached in. Now, in this hospital bed, doctors were struggling to explain the rare bacterial contamination spreading through his bloodstream. Aggressive, unusual, difficult to identify. They traced possible exposures back years through the careful geography of his service. Whitaker listened without comment. Something in him, quiet and knowing, did not seem entirely surprised. Ranger refused his evening meal that day. The nurse set the bowl near the door. He did not move toward it. Downstairs, near the polished reception desk, funeral coordinators spoke gently with Emily's husband about veterans' honors and service arrangements. The language was practiced and respectful and premature. No one paid particular attention to the young black woman who stepped through the automatic doors at that moment, carrying a worn canvas bag and holding, with both hands and extraordinary care, a single glass bottle filled with clear water. Her name was Sarah O'Coffer. She had grown up in Ohio, the daughter of parents who had immigrated from East Africa before she was born, who had raised her in a small apartment in Columbus with photographs of the village they came from hung above the kitchen table. She had studied public health at a state university, driven by something she could never fully explain to her professors, a need to understand why clean water, a thing so ordinary in the country where she grew up, had been the thing that killed her cousin Kiru before he turned 10 years old. She paused just inside the hospital entrance, taking in the gleaming floors and the muted artwork on the walls and the quiet hum of a building entirely devoted to keeping people alive. Her coat was practical, rather than warm. Her shoes had covered considerable distance. She had rehearsed this moment across many sleepless nights, and now that it was here, every rehearsed word felt suddenly inadequate. In her canvas bag, wrapped in folded cloth, was a bottle filled from the well in Odemi, water she had collected on her last visit to her parents' village 2 years prior, carried home, and kept ever since, waiting for a moment she had always believed would eventually come. She approached the reception desk with steady hands. "I need to see Colonel James Whitaker," she said quietly. "Family only, I am afraid," replied the receptionist with a sympathetic smile. "I understand, but what I have to tell him cannot wait much longer, and I believe he would want to hear it." Her voice did not waver, her eyes did not drop. Upstairs, without reason or prompting, Ranger rose from the floor and stood at the foot of the bed. After a phone call placed upstairs to Emily, and a long pause and a quiet conversation no one else could hear, Sarah was permitted to take the elevator. She stood alone as the doors closed, watching the floor numbers rise. Her reflection in the polished metal looked older than her 31 years. She thought of Kiru, of how he used to chase goats through the dust, laughing at nothing in particular, the way only children laugh. She thought of the pump the day it was installed, and the pride that had moved through the village like a warm current. She thought of the winter it all changed. Kiru was 9 years old when he first said the water tasted different. Her aunt had dismissed it gently. They had trusted the system, trusted the engineers who had come with their equipment and their blueprints and their unmistakable belief that they were doing something good. By the 3rd week, Kiru's laughter had gone quiet. Fever came in the evenings and did not leave. Sarah had sat beside him during one visit, holding a cup of that same water to his lips, because it was the only comfort available. He did not survive that winter. The official reports cited bacterial contamination, maintenance failure, contributing factors unclear, but Sarah had never forgotten the name engraved on the small metal plaque above the original installation: Colonel James Whitaker. The elevator doors opened. Ranger was standing at the doorway when she reached the corridor. He did not growl, he did not retreat. He simply watched her approach with those steady amber eyes, as though he had been expecting exactly this, as though something in him had understood, before anyone else in the room, that this young woman's arrival was not a disruption, but a completion. Sarah paused outside the room. She pressed one hand flat against the wall and breathed. Then she pushed open the door. The room was quieter than she had expected, smaller. The medals on the wall caught her eye first. She had imagined them, had seen photographs. But seeing them in person, beside a man lying this still, they looked less like honors and more like evidence of a life given over entirely to something larger than itself. Whitaker's eyes were closed. They opened slowly at the sound of the door. He studied her face across the room, searching, patient, the way a man searches when something in him recognizes what his memory cannot yet place. "You led the Odemi Water Project," Sarah said. Her voice was gentle. It did not shake. The room went completely still. Emily stepped forward from the window. Whitaker held up one hand, barely, just enough, and she stopped. "Yes," he said. The word came out quietly, with no defense built around it. Sarah reached into her bag and withdrew the bottle. She held it up carefully, and the afternoon light moved through it and made it look innocent, clear, ordinary, harmless as anything. "This water is from that well," Sarah said. "My cousin Kiru drank from it. He was 9 years old. The number fell into the room and did not dissipate. It stayed there, between them, in the air. Whitaker's breath caught. Not from the illness, from something older. The stone that had lived in his pocket for so many years pressed suddenly inward, sharp and undeniable. His eyes closed. When they opened again, they were different. Something had come down behind them, some final wall, some last defense. "I signed off on temporary filters," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "The supplier assured me replacements would arrive in weeks. I trusted that." "I know," Sarah said. "I read every document I could find. I understand what happened." She stepped closer to the bed. Her hands were clasped in front of her, still holding the bottle. "I am not here to accuse you," she said. "I am here because for 15 years I have carried the question of whether you knew, whether anyone knew, whether Kiru mattered to anyone beyond our village." Her voice did not break, but her eyes filled, slow and quiet, the way deep water fills, without drama. "He mattered," Whitaker said, and the two words came out of him like something that had been held underwater for a very long time. Emily pressed her hand to her mouth. She turned toward the window. Sarah looked at the old man in the bed, this decorated soldier, this builder of bridges, this man who had spent his entire life trying to leave the world better than he found it, and she saw something she had not expected to find. She saw grief that matched her own. Not identical, not equal, but real. "I carried anger for a long time," Sarah said softly. "Anger at the system. Anger at the reports that said nothing. Anger at the name on the plaque." She paused. "But anger is exhausting, and I am tired of carrying it." A single tear moved slowly down Whitaker's cheek. He did not wipe it away. Ranger stepped forward from the foot of the bed and walked, slowly, stiffly, with the deliberate care of an old animal, to where Sarah stood. He looked up at her for a long moment. Then he pressed his silver muzzle gently against her hand. Sarah lowered herself slightly, her free hand moving to the top of his head. Her fingers trembled once, then stilled. "He trusts what he understands. He must understand you." "I understand loss," Sarah replied. Whitaker nodded, as if that single sentence explained everything that needed explaining. "I am sorry," he said then. Not Colonel Whitaker, not the engineer, not the decorated veteran, not the founder of the firm with the newspaper clipping in the drawer. Just a man. Just those two words, stripped of everything except what they were. "I am deeply, genuinely sorry." Sarah straightened. She looked at him for a long time. "I forgive you," she said. The words were simple. They were not easy. Everyone in the room understood the difference. Outside the window, a single autumn leaf let go of its branch and spiraled downward in long, unhurried arcs, as though it too had been waiting for permission to fall. Whitaker was quiet for a long moment after that. His breathing was shallow but steady. Then he turned his head toward Emily. "Call my attorney," he said. Emily looked between her father and the young woman standing beside his bed. Then she nodded once and stepped into the hallway, phone already in her hand. The attorney arrived within the hour. Funeral coordinators were thanked and dismissed. Papers that had outlined final arrangements were set aside. In their place, new documents began to take shape. Documents tied to the firm's remaining assets and a dedicated charitable trust directed specifically toward the complete reconstruction and long-term maintenance of the Odemi water system. independent inspectors, modern filtration, locally sourced backup components, training programs for village technicians to sustain the system themselves without dependence on outside supply chains. No temporary measures, no assurances accepted without verification, no shortcuts. The estate will be significantly reduced, the attorney said carefully. Whitaker's gaze sharpened, the old command presence surfacing through the weakness, steady and unmistakable. Then it will be significantly reduced, he said. Ranger exhaled a long, slow breath from beside the bed, as though the decision had confirmed something he had always known about the man he had spent his life beside. That night, something changed in the room. The furrow that had lived between Whitaker's brows for as long as Emily could remember smoothed. His sleep came earlier and settled deeper. By morning, new lab results returned with unexpected clarity. The bacterial strain had been fully identified, rare and aggressive, but treatable. A specific antibiotic regimen was recommended immediately. "We may have found a path forward," the doctor said. Emily sat down beside the bed and let herself cry. Quietly, the way people cry when relief and grief arrive at the same moment and cannot be separated from each other. Whitaker opened his eyes and found her there. "Hey," he said softly. She took his hand. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Ranger lay with his chin on the mattress, eyes half closed, watching over them both. Treatment began at once. The weeks that followed were slow and full of the particular exhaustion that comes from not doing too much, but from waiting. Whitaker grew stronger in increments. Sarah visited twice more before returning to Columbus. She and Whitaker talked at length about Kiru, about the village, about the kind of systems that fail quietly and the kind that hold. He asked her to serve as liaison for the Reconstruction Trust. She accepted without hesitation. When Whitaker was finally discharged, Ranger walked beside him out of the hospital as he had once walked beside him out of forward operating bases. Slowly, steadily, together. The autumn air was cold and clean. Emily drove them home through cornfields stripped bare and golden under a wide Ohio sky. At the farmhouse, Whitaker settled back into his old wooden chair on the porch. Ranger lay at his feet. The field stretched out before them in the late afternoon light, quiet and familiar and deeply good. But Ranger was slowing. It happened the way it always does with old dogs, gradually, then all at once. His walks grew shorter, his joints stiffened in the cold. One morning, he could no longer climb the porch steps on his own, and Whitaker came down and sat beside him on the grass instead, without hesitation, without a word of complaint, because that was simply what you did for someone who had never once left your side. He lay beside Ranger on the old porch blanket that night, under a sky thick with stars, one hand resting on the dog's silver flank. "You stayed," Whitaker murmured, "through all of it. You never once left." Ranger's breathing was slow and even. His tail moved once, just once, against the ground. "I am going to be all right," Whitaker told him, "because of you, because you stayed long enough for me to finish." Ranger died before morning, peacefully, exactly where he had always chosen to be, beside the man he had been given to watch over, on the land they had walked together across a decade of quiet and faithful mornings. Whitaker buried him beneath the old oak tree at the edge of the property overlooking the fields. He dug the grave himself, slowly, resting when he needed to, never once considering asking for help. He placed the smooth river stone from Odemi beside the grave marker, the one that had arrived in Sarah's wooden box, carried from the village well. He stood there for a long time with his hat in his hands and the autumn wind moving through the bare branches above him. "Loyalty," he said quietly, to the earth and the tree and the wide Ohio sky, "is finishing the watch." The seasons turned. Whitaker's health stabilized beyond what any of the doctors had dared to predict. He walked the property again, slowly, with a cane on harder days, but he walked it. He spoke at small veteran gatherings about accountability, about the difference between good intentions and good outcomes, about the responsibility that does not end when the paperwork is filed and the project is declared complete. Young engineers came to listen. Some of them wept. In Odemi, the reconstruction was completed the following summer. A new pump was installed. The filtration system was modern, redundant, and locally maintained. On the day it was commissioned, the village gathered in the morning light and clean water poured through new pipes into buckets held by children who had never known anything different, and by elders who remembered what different had felt like. At the base of the pump, a small brass plaque caught the early sun. Kiru Okafor, because every child deserves clean water. Sarah sent the photograph the same afternoon. Whitaker received it on his phone, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside him. He looked at the image for a very long time. The children laughing, the water flowing, the plaque gleaming in the light of a place he had never personally visited, but had thought about nearly every day for 15 years. He set the phone down. He pressed both hands flat on the table. He bowed his head. Emily found him like that a few minutes later and understood without asking. She sat down beside him and put her arm around his shoulders, and they stayed that way together in the quiet kitchen while the morning light moved slowly across the floor. Whitaker lived several more years beyond every prediction, long enough to see letters arrive from Odemi, long enough to receive a photograph of a child named James, born to a young mother who had chosen the name deliberately and with full knowledge of its weight. On his final morning, he sat on a porch in the early light. The oak tree stood bare and still in the yard. The fields stretched out golden and quiet in every direction. Emily sat beside him, holding his hand. "I am not afraid," he said. She tightened her grip. She did not trust her voice. His gaze moved to the oak tree, to the place beneath it where the earth was smooth and the stone from Odemi rested, half covered now by fallen leaves. "I finished what I could," he said softly. "That has to be enough." And then his breathing slowed, and then it stilled, and the machines, for the first time, fell quiet. At his funeral, veterans stood in salute. The flag was folded with steady hands and presented to Emily. The honor guard's rifle volley rang across the crisp October air and rolled away into the distance like thunder heading home. But perhaps the truest tribute came 3 weeks later in a letter that arrived from Columbus in Sarah's careful handwriting. She had enclosed it with the final trust report, the one that confirmed the Odemi system was fully operational, fully funded for the next decade, fully maintained by local hands. The letter said only this: "He listened when listening was the hardest thing. He finished what others would have left behind. He gave my cousin's name to clean water, and now that name will outlast all of us. That is what a good soldier looks like when the uniform comes off." Emily placed the letter on the mantelpiece beside the medals, beside the photograph of Ranger beneath the oak tree, beside the smooth stone from Odemi that had traveled so far to find its resting place. And somewhere across the world, in a village that had once grieved quietly and alone, clean water continued to flow beneath a wide, bright sky, steady and faithful and clean, long after the man who had made it right had gone home for the last time. The greatest courage is not always the kind the world witnesses. Sometimes it is the quiet kind, the kind that admits mistake, accepts the full weight of it, and chooses even at the very end to finish what was once left undone. Beyond the badge. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something worth keeping, please subscribe and share the story with someone who needs to hear it. Here at Beyond the Badge, we believe that service does not end with a discharge paper. It lives in every quiet act of accountability, loyalty, and love that follows. Every story we tell is a promise that no faithful life goes unremembered. Subscribe, share, carry the stories forward, because the badge never truly comes off.